Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. MP Satija, Professor retired from the Department of Library and Information Science, Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar. Topic for discussion here is the species of library classification. It may be noted that species are nothing but kinds of classification. There are various kinds of classification by design, by purpose. So accordingly we can divide them or categorize them. Classification is an act, technique, process, and also a product. Library classifications such as the Dewey Decimal Classification, colon classification, and the Universal Decimal Classification are systems. These can be designed by various techniques now and for different libraries according to their needs. And when they have different kinds and number of documents and for varied level of their users. When the DDC and later enumerative classification, universal decimal classification, subject classification, and UDC were developed, all were called simply classification or library classification. There was no other terms for them then. But when the CC was published in 1933 in India, it was a paradigm shift. It was different from the rest, both in layout, design, methodology, and method of application, and of course, the results it produced. It produced revolutionary results. Library scientists named it Faceted classification and retrospectively gave the name enumerative classification to the earlier systems like the DDC, LC, etc. But Ranganathan, in characteristic manner, studied philosophically and historically development of library classification systems over a century in historical perspectives. He perceived a continuity in the evolution of library classification in their methods and their objectives since their origin in late 19th century. Going beyond the duality of enumerative versus faceted species, Ranganathan found many more species of classification in between at different evolutionary stages from near enumerative to analytical synthetic classification, of which the BC is the best example now and seems at the pinnacle. Species as discovered by Ranganathan are enumerative, almost faceted, rigidly faceted, freely faceted, and analytical synthetic classification. But it may be noted that all are in a continuity. There is no deception in the development of classifications in the universe of knowledge and their application in libraries. Over the century of library classification, we have seen the emergence and evolution of different types of classification in the libraries. So these can be categorized into various species as they belong to the same family, that is of classifications. The first criteria of making species of classification by the area of coverage. The first is special classifications, which are limited to a specific area of knowledge. For example, there can be a classification for only social sciences. Not only this, classification for economics, or there can be a classification for interdisciplinary studies for Indology, classification for women's studies, classification for children's studies, and so on. These are special classifications which are constrained by the area of coverage, and these are usually required in special classification system, and they are meant for their detailed subject analysis, and they require to classify micro documents such as journal articles, research reports, theses, patents, and so on. And the second, of course, is general classification systems, which are characterized by covering the entire universe of knowledge. In library classification, they were the first to emerge. They cover the entire world of knowledge. Examples are the Dewey Decimal Classification, Universal Decimal Classification, Library of Congress Classification, Colon Classification, and so on. There can also be some homemade classifications which cover the entire universe of knowledge. But some classifications, there is some lopsided. A general classification may be more inclined toward, let us say, social sciences, or it may be more useful for science and technology and so on, but still they are known as general classifications. Then by depth of coverage, it is just analogous to or related to the area of coverage. Broad classifications and depth classification. Broad classifications are such which do not provide enough details and are suitable for small libraries or provide a synopsis of the knowledge area covered by them. For example, the three summaries of the Dewey Decimal Classification are some sort of broad classification which can be used. Mostly general classification are considered as relatively broad classifications. Then we come to depth classification as contrasted from broad classifications. Such systems provide maximum details, full details, and are usually required for documentation work, information work, and in special libraries or information centers or special classifications usually are depth classification system, and they are useful for classifying micro documents such as patents, theses, dissertations, and other form of materials. The third category of classification division can be by their function. What function do they perform in the libraries? On the basis of these functions, a library classification can be divided into three species or three categories: cognitive classifications, bibliographic classifications, bibliothecal classification, or library classifications. The cognitive or knowledge classifications are usually termed as knowledge classification systems. Their purpose is to show the map and structure of knowledge as viewed by the maker, or it is a structure accepted by the majority. Mostly these are prepared by philosophers or scientists to take stock of knowledge. And library classifications are also concerned with these cognitive systems. For example, Henry Bliss spent most of his time in discovering the map of knowledge, and he wanted to discover that knowledge to reflect in his classification, which were accepted by majority of the scientists and philosophers. And it was known as consensus or classification, which was among the consensus of these philosophers. And cognitive classifications, they are map of the knowledge that is seen by that time. But it may be noted that this cognitive structure of classification varies from time to time and culture to culture. What the DDC represents as a cognitive structure is no more valid in the 21st century, for example. On the other hand, Ranganathan also spent a lot of time and gave a lot of time in studying the structure of knowledge by his study of the universe of knowledge, and used that to arrange his main classes, and also within main classes the types of main classes he discovered, the canonical classes he discovered, that also reflected the cognitive structure of knowledge. Cognitive classifications can also be knowledge classifications. For example, the first type is taxonomic systems of classification of some entities such as plant taxonomy, animal taxonomy, periodic table of chemical, and a few more examples. For example, classification of diseases, classification of occupations, and so on. Taxonomy of further classification of diseases or classification of occupation may also fall in these categories. And these are very useful for studying the structure of the subject and also for classifying in that smaller areas. They also discover gaps in knowledge. For example, the arrangement of elements in the periodic table when was made for the first time provided some gaps of some elements, and it was predicted that these elements must be found sometime, and later those elements were really found in the nature. It means that taxonomic classifications are useful for discovery of knowledge. Then another form of taxonomic or cognitive classification is knowledge classifications as given by our Vedic system. Knowledge classification, these are the maps of entire universe of knowledge prepared by philosophers from time to time. For example, in the Vedas, which were written in about 1500 before Christ, there are 4 categories of knowledge in general. That is dharma, arth, kam, and moksha. And these are arranged in this logic order that the society moves from dharma and lastly to the moksha. So this is also a sort of a knowledge classification, but this knowledge classification has not been mostly applied to our library classification. The other 2 species of classification, that is bibliographic classification and bibliothecal classification, are a sort of library classification. Of course, they are again based upon knowledge classification, but mostly they are useful for libraries as contrasted from taxonomic classifications which were used by the scientists to classify their entities. These are all knowledge classifications which are preserved by the philosophers and scientists. These I'm talking of these taxonomies. But the 2 species of bibliographical classifications and bibliothecal classifications are also useful for the libraries. The first bibliographical classification is they are library classification systems which are mostly designed to organize microliterature in the form of bibliographies and indexes. The universal decimal classification was designed for the purpose of arranging entries in the proposed universal bibliography by the International Institute of Bibliography, established in 1895 as the forerunner of FID. Obviously, it is a depth classification, and this UDC was not designed to be used as a shelf arrangement. It was designed to classify microliterature, scientific literature published all over the world, and therefore they added many synthetic equipment to this newly formed system to make it useful for microliterature. And these bibliographical classifications are useful for information retrieval. Though UDC was the first such classifications, but other classifications that, for example, the colon classification and the bibliographic classification second edition also fall in this category. As Ranganathan's colon classification is a faceted classification, and it can be useful for retrieving documents and also the information contained in them. And the third, of course, is a bibliothecal classification, means the library classification. Such systems are designed at the first instance as library classifications or shelf arrangement systems in libraries. In the modern librarianship, the DDC was the first such system, though all earlier systems before the DB-decimal classification system, so-called fixed location systems, were seen as shelf arrangement systems, because in those days classification was largely seen as a shelf arrangement system, and it was not assigned any other role in the library other than grouping or subjective grouping of documents on the shelves for browsing and for collocation of subjects. And of course, later these classifications have improved somewhat, and they are trying to serve to some extent bibliographical functions too. So we can say that DDC over the years, by utilizing the advances in modern classification theory, is also trying to be a bibliographical classifications. But also it may be noted that it may be successful in this function to some extent, but it will not be successful in the first function, that is cognitive functions, because its structure cannot be changed. It may be noted that these functions, that is the cognitive function, bibliographical function, and bibliographical functions, are given in the order of their decreasing power. A classification system which is useful for as a cognitive system is also useful for bibliographical and bibliographical systems. Then, on the other hand, bibliographical classification can also be used for information retrieval as well as for shelf arrangement, but it may not be useful as a cognitive system. Whereas the bibliographical classifications or library classifications have only one function, that is library classification, and they may not be able to perform the upper two functions, that is cognitive function and bibliographical functions. For example, the Writers International Classification can only perform this shelf arrangement and it will not at all perform the upper two functions. Whereas Ranganathan's colon classification is well suited to perform all the three functions. It is a map of knowledge, it is useful for information retrieval, and of course it can also be useful for shelf arrangement. Another criteria for species of classification is from the structural viewpoint or their layout. From the structure, the library classifications are broadly divided into two categories, that is enumerative systems and faceted systems. It may be noted that in the beginning, in the 19th century, when the DDC was designed, it was simply enumerative systems, but then with the coming of Ranganathan in the fourth decade of the 20th century, we also saw the emergence of faceted systems. So these became two important species of classifications. Enumerative systems or listing systems. All library classifications prior to Ranganathan's colon classification published in 1933 were more or less structurally similar. The term enumerative classification was coined post-publication of colon classification to distinguish such systems. It is just as the term landline telephone was coined only after the invention and popularity of the cellular phones. Otherwise, before that, all phones were phones. Ranganathan's system was a faceted system by structure. It was different. It was a game changer in theory and practice of library classification. The term enumerative classification was coined to distinguish Ranganathan's system from rest of the lot. Enumeration means listing. An enumerative classification is a more or less systematic list of all the subjects in the universe of past, present, and of the near future. So this is a list which is almost a frozen one when it is published, and it is also known as mark and park systems, or it is also known as pigeonholes, because all the subjects are listed along with their numbers, notation, and the classifier has only to locate the number needed for that book and putting that number on that document, and hence it's known as enumerative system, that is mark with the class number and park on the shelves. It's a mark and park system. It's also known pigeonholing because every book is given a rigid or one system, which is a hole, a place in which every book has to be fitted in. Faceted classifications. The first truly faceted classification was Ranganathan's colon classification, published in 1933. Though some library classification historians see clear but undeveloped antecedents of a faceted system in the UDC first published in 1904. Some people believe that UDC was the first faceted classification system, but it may be noted that UDC of course allowed synthesis, but the subjects were mostly enumerated. They were not divided into facets as Ranganathan did. So in a faceted classification, there is no long list of all the subjects. It's not a dictionary or long list of subjects as in the enumerative classification. In the faceted classification system, the universe of knowledge is broken from the whole into the smallest parts called isolates. Let us see the diagram. In a faceted classification system, universe of knowledge is broken into disciplines and subdisciplines. For example, natural sciences, humanities, social sciences. Then each discipline is further divided into main classes, as do the enumerative classifications. In the main classes, for example, these are traditional areas, coherent areas of knowledge. In social sciences, let us say the main classes may be economics, political science, sociology, education, and so on. Then here, within the main class, the concepts are seen into small, divided into categories. Categories are broader groups of knowledge having some similarities. Ranganathan gave a postulate that in the universe of knowledge, there are only 5 categories of concepts. That is personality, matter, energy, space, and time, that you will learn in some another module. Then within categories, the concepts are divided into facets. Facets are groups of concepts got by single train of characteristics. And within the facets, we come to the last individual terms, isolates. And isolates, the term used by Colon, are the smallest units of knowledge which cannot be subdivided. So in a faceted classification, then these facets and isolates are recombined to give a tailor-made class number to the document under classification. So there is no marking and parking, but you have to tailor the subject, you have to construct the class number according to the specific subject of the document. Though in the Western literature, we come across mostly 2 rival systems, broader system, that is enumerative and faceted. But Ranganathan, in his characteristic manner, studied the history of classification and saw that there is an evolutionary development of classification species. And he added, in between the enumerative and the faceted system, he discovered some more species, and further he also saw some more developments in the faceted systems. So in all, we have these species as follows. First of all, the primitive species was the enumerative classification, and its examples are the Library of Congress and Writers' International Classification. Almost enumerative classification now is that in which there are mostly lists and few common isolates. Ranganathan will put the DDC as an almost enumerative classification. Expansive classifications, PC1 was also almost enumerative classifications. Almost faceted classification was the classification which has some basic subjects, some compound subjects, and many more series of standard subdivisions or form divisions which can be added. Ranganathan called UDC as almost faceted classification. Then comes the rigidly faceted classification. Looking retrospectively, the first edition of classification by Ranganathan, that is Colon classification, is now termed as rigidly faceted classification, because in those days the facet formula was rigid. Then he evolved, refined that rigidly faceted classification into freely faceted classification. And freely faceted classification is also known as analytico-synthetic classification. Of course, Ranganathan's Colon classification's 7th edition is the analytico-synthetic classification, but also few other classifications. For example, the 2nd edition of BC2 is an analytico-synthetic classification, and the UDC is also heading towards analytico-synthetic classification. And Ranganathan sees a clear line of evolution in more than 100 years of the history of library classification as moving slowly from enumerative to the analytico-synthetic systems. Ranganathan's views on the evolution of species of library classification can be represented by this diagram. And this diagram clearly shows that of library classification there are 2 species broadly, enumerative and faceted. Then among the enumerative, Ranganathan divided them into 2 kinds, that is purely enumerative and almost enumerative. Among the purely enumerative, still we have some examples, that is Library of Congress classification and Writers' International Classification. And almost enumerative, you can say that DDC is almost enumerative, though there is some synthesis. Then the second species is faceted classification. Faceted classification are again of 3 types, that is almost faceted, and that is what Ranganathan thought is a UDC. Though UDC has now gone further than this. Then the second is rigidly faceted. The first edition of Ranganathan's 1933 can now be called as rigidly faceted classification, and this rigidly faceted classification system continued up to the 4th edition, which published in the year 1952. But this rigidly faceted classification had many problems. They were not as efficient and the numbers were cumbersome. So then the solution was found in breaking the rigidity of the facet formula and what was evolved as known as freely faced classification. The fifth and sixth edition of classification by Ranganathan are freely faced classification. Then by further refinement, freely faced classification is also can be known as analytico-synthetic classifications. Then it can be very clearly seen that the bibliographic classification second edition is a example of analytico-synthetic classification, and also the seventh edition of the Colon classification is also an analytico-synthetic classification. Of course, Ranganathan has seen a clear line of evolution or progressive evolution from enumerative to the analytic synthetic classification, with one exception of Ryder's International Classification, which was published in the year 1962, and it was a purely enumerative classification. And of course, it was an experiment which he tried to swim against the current of times, but he failed, and this classification has never been used, and it is simply getting dust on the library shelves. So rather we can say it was in some sort of oddity in the evolution of library classification systems. Evolution of faceted systems. But due to pioneering and constant research by Dr. S. R. Ranganathan, there has been an evolution in faceted classification to solve its day-to-day problem and to make library classifications more user-friendly and efficient in information retrieval. In his own terminology, Ranganathan divides faceted classification into two evolutionary stages. That is, first rigidly faceted classification, and which was again current thinking. The various species of classification as given by Ranganathan are considered as the Indian school of thought. In current classification literature published all over the world, Ranganathan's scholastic categories of species of classification are not popular. It could also be due to the fact that his qualifying terms such as almost, enumerative, or almost faceted are non-scientific. In sciences, there is no criteria to measure something called almost. Popularly, these are only two categories of enumerative and faceted systems which are prevalent in the literature. Enumerative systems are led by Library of Congress classification, while the CC or even now BC are CC is the original, but BC is the latest example of such faceted systems. Such scholars also surely include UDC in the category of faceted systems. Nevertheless, they accept over the years a third species has emerged from old systems trying to adopt some of Ranganathan's ideas and methods. It is facing grafted over an enumerative base. Its best example is the evolution of the DDC, especially since its 18th edition published in 1971, when the number of auxiliary tables was raised to 7 in addition to the provision of some internal tables of limited applicability here and there now. Now the DDC has of course only 6 tables. Further, number of add to instructions or provisions is increasing addition by addition. Indeed, the DDC as of now is a class in itself by system. Ranganathan's theory of species of classification not withstanding. Nowadays, hybrid systems, the term is very popular. Since the invention of the colon classification, synthesis of class number has become a trend. Even the born enumerative and hierarchical systems are now increasingly making provisions for synthesis to provide coextensive class numbers or tailor-made class numbers for micro-subjects. It is done through provision of more and more general auxiliary tables of form, languages, people, places, relations, materials, processes, and many more. Provision of tables of special subdivisions, internal tables, under different classes. For example, in the DDC, a long table of diagnosis and treatment of diseases has been given under 614 diseases. The DDC and UDC now abound in such tables. More provisions of synthesis of numbers are made through add to instructions. It is taking a part or whole of number from anywhere in the schedules for addition to a base. Such a provision did exist in the DDC since second edition, yet from the 18th edition, 1971, it has increasingly resorted to provide specific class numbers by synthesis. So, DDC now is a very good example of what we call hybrid systems of classification. To summarize this very interesting evolution of classification systems, we can say that concept of species of library classification emerged only after the publication of the colon classification in 1933. Before that, all systems were only classifications or library classifications. Earlier, all classifications were the same species, later called enumerative systems. Means that the term enumerative system was coined after the publication of a faceted system to distinguish it from the earlier ones. As we have the term landline telephones coined after the invention of the mobile phones. Before the mobile phones, all phones were phones. And of course, it may be remembered that knowledge classification has no species, because knowledge classification is simply a list, a systematic list of all the subjects in the universe of knowledge, and the list is exhaustive. So the term species of classification applies only to library classification. It may be remembered that species are kinds of classification differentiated by their internal structure and design methodology. Two broader species are enumerative and faceted ones. Over the years, a third has emerged in which faceting is grafted on an enumerative systems, as it is happening in the DDC. For Ranganasan, there are two species of a fully faceted classification, rigidly faceted and freely faceted. Later is also analytico-synthetic in nature, which is most advanced species. And nowadays, all classification systems try to be analytico-synthetic classifications that are more useful for information retrieval. In the history of library classification, there is a progressive evolution from faceted to analytico-synthetic system with a simple or one example exception of the Ryder's International Classification published in the year 1961. An enumerative system is difficult to design, of course, but easy to use, though bulky in size. Even child can use it, and it also requires a big and very efficient index. A faceted system is easy to design, but relatively difficult to use, though slim in size. In the beginning, Ranganasan's colon classification was considered a very difficult scheme to learn and apply. So was the case with UDC, whereas the DDC in early days was very simple to use. A faceted system is a machine to design or construct class numbers, whereas an enumerative system is a register or list of subjects and their class numbers. A faceted classification is more hospitable, has more inbuilt notation, it is multi-dimensional, and it is very, very useful for information retrieval. And also, it gives the faceted structure of the universe of knowledge. And enumerative system is most suited for a static universe of knowledge. Though the trend is for faceted classification system in organizing knowledge in libraries, but it said they are difficult to apply, and of course, but they are an answer to the growing universe of knowledge to accommodate new subjects. But if the universe of knowledge was static, then enumerative systems would have been better and more compatible to use. But this is not the case, as the universe of knowledge is growing and growing turbulently. Therefore, enumerative systems are no more in fashion, and everybody is resorting to or recommending the use of faceted classification system. Not only this, all the modern classification systems are faceted in nature, whether they are general classification or whether they are special classification systems. Online classifications. These days, there's a trend of having classification systems held in computers. Though strictly speaking, these are not species of classification, but the format in which classifications are held and displayed. Classifications play an important role in online searching and retrieval. At the same time, computers have enormously facilitated the design and editing of classification systems. Most of the living classification systems have digitized their print schedules and held them in computers since 1990s. Now, their various versions and editions are rather born digital, and various versions are derived from the databases of classification systems held in electronic files. For example, the UDC is now converted into master reference file called MRF, and the electronic edition of the DDC is now known as WebDB, is prepared from the DDC database. The electronic editions have many additional features for number locations, number synthesis, have many nodes and additional material and facilities not possible in print versions. The print version derived from the databases are merely discounted versions or toned down versions of the electronic form. The major systems such as the DDC, UDC, and the Library of Congress are available both in print and electronic versions.